So just a few words to welcome you to the 10th edition of BCBT. We started in 2008, and we are closing here a cycle of 10 years. And well, the school has also a short, reduced size because of some bank holidays. We will have from the 30th of August to the 8th of September. It's, you will find the 10th edition of BCBT on the web with all the speakers and participants. So if you're curious about when it started and how it was, please go on the web and check them out. Wait a sec. A few numbers. Where is it? Here. Since 2008, we had a total of 199 speakers and 291 participants. This year, we started with a number of speakers and participants that were equal, but slowly we had an increase of participants, and we were more selective in the speakers. But so this year we are also very happy to have close to us our friends of the very first editions, like Anil Seth and Lea Krubitzer, and of course my co-organizers, Paul Verschure and Tony Prescott. BCBT has been sponsored for a long time by the Convergent Science Network for biomimetics and neurotechnology, and the goal of which was to advance the understanding and engineering of biomimetic and hybrid and biological and artificial systems. So through this CSN, we have sponsored BCBT for at least 6 years. But not only, we also have started another conference, Living Machines, that is at its 6th edition. So we invite you as well to take a look at this conference, and maybe you can participate at the upcoming editions. We also had other EU projects supporting BCBT and throughout the years, and including this year EpiSense from the Human Brain Project. So the program committee of BCBT is represented by Paul Verschure from UPF and ICREA and IBAC, Tony Prescott from Sheffield University, and Anna Mura, myself from UPF, and in the future IBAC. And previous program committee included Lea Krubitzer here in the audience today, Andreas Engel from Hamburg University, and Anil Seth on the very first edition. So what's the aim of BCBT? Was always to bring top-of-the-line researchers to make sure that the students that attended and all the participants really got some more profound understanding and knowledge of, in a way, of the Evo-Devo dilemma that has been one of the main topics of the school, or learn about the principle behind brain architectures and how to find ways to build artificial systems based on natural principles, as well as sort out the narrow basis of consciousness, which is the topic of this year. And Anil Seth will kickstart the school today. Just some practical questions before Paul takes the microphone and introduces Anil. The school includes lectures that are to be taken in the morning, and like pills, like happy pills, every morning. Then we have tutorials in the afternoon and projects. There will be some with you and the people that will be leading the projects. There will be some discussions today and tomorrow, and there will be some projects will be defined that will be carried on until the end of the school and will be presented by you guys at the end of the school on next Friday, on the last Friday of the school. But we also have happier events, happier, with some drinks and food and dinners. It's all in the program. If you find some inconsistency in time, so don't be upset. Just I will explain it to you. Maybe some errors. Here, just to explain the where you will be doing the tutorials is in the computer room, just across the square from us in a building called Talleres in room 54004. Sorry, there will be a bunch of computers, and you can do the tutorials there in the afternoon after lunch. The lunch, it just also across the square, but underneath the square. So follow the people and the smell of food, and you will find where to eat. And for the speakers, Paul and Tony always invite the speakers to do some podcast interviews. So if you are available, the speakers, for some very interesting discussions with Paul and Tony. Actually, yes. So we have to ask them. Okay. And these lectures, are available in our podcast called BCBT, CSN Network podcast. So all the events that have been recorded here during BCBT, you can find them available here. As well, you can find the video lectures of most of the BCBT presentations during since 2011, 2008, and the other ones is more complicated. Follow us on Twitter if you can. If you have Twitter, just tweet about the lecture. And I'll leave you with that. I don't know if I left anything out. Yes, for Friday, but you will find the information in the booklet and the brochure you have, the Welcome Apéro. It's in a special terrace where we have been doing it for the last 10 years. So without much ado, I will leave the microphone to Paul. Thank you.
All right. Okay, so good morning, everybody. I will have some more announcements after the talks of this morning. So it's great that we are here now together for our 10th anniversary BCBT. It's going to be a lot of fun, a lot of work to be done. And I will give you a bit more background, but let's first kick off with our science. So this morning, our first speaker is Anil Seth. Anil and I share common roots. And because we were both actually at the Neurosciences Institute in San Diego, working with Jerry Edelman, but he was sort of the younger generation, and I was like the older generation. And by the time that Anil was there, I had left already a long time ago. But I think what also brought us to that place, what also gave us this common background, was this wish and this drive to try to look at the brain not only from, let's say, an empirical perspective, like what's the data, how can we sort of describe that system at different levels using different techniques, but especially how can we then again capture all this data in a sort of a theoretical perspective. How can we really build a theory of the brain as a system? And this was, of course, something that Jerry Edelman, who was running the Neuroscience Institute then, was very much advocating, and he wrote different books on that. So Anil then actually very quickly, from, let's say, coming out of sort of artificial life, genetic algorithms, a bit of culture, they're already then in Sussex, right, from the beginning. So he was sort of had a short vacation in San Diego, then he went back. But Then he discovered consciousness, or he had discovered his own consciousness a few years earlier, but then he discovered it as sort of a scientific phenomenon, and he really got hooked on that question. So since then, Anil has been really very systematically chipping away at this problem of consciousness. Like, what's consciousness? How can we explain it? And also, how can we investigate it empirically? And by now, Anil has really become one of the leaders in that field. So for us, it's of course fantastic that we can have him here, and hear the latest insights about consciousness from the horse's mouth. So, Anil, it's a great pleasure to have you here. I'm really looking forward to your talk and about the latest advances in the study of consciousness.
Kind introduction.
My pleasure. And as he plugs in, I should also mention that Anil was as he's wasting time. In BCBT, when we started, there was early on there was this interest from my side to really delve into consciousness, because this is clearly at sort of the horizon of our science, a very complex issue. And I turned to Anil to help us organize that. So as a co-chair of those editions of BCBT, he has also done a fantastic job to bring really the leaders of the field here. But now we have the only one we need to hear it from. So Anil.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Paul. And yeah, it's a great pleasure to be back. It's 10 years, which is very scary. And I thought, just to honour the introduction from Paul and Anna, that I've retitled my talk, Sorting Out the Problem of Consciousness. That is what we're here to do today. So, let's see if this is going to work. Hold on, sorry, already a problem. Let me try this one. The clicker. One sec, sorry.
Sort out your computer first.
Exactly, that's part of the problem.
Do you need another?
I can manage without a clicker if it's not working. It's not critical, of course.
Here, use mine. Use this one. This usually works.
Let's try that. It's all gone. No, it's not having clickers this morning. Never mind. Never mind. Well, we'll manage. Yeah. Okay. So, consciousness is a fascinating but elusive phenomenon. It's impossible to specify what it is, what it does, or why it evolved. This was Stuart Sutherland, who was the founding professor of psychology at my University of Sussex. 1989, which is quite a long time ago, but not that long ago. And most damningly, he said, nothing worth reading has been written on it. And this was in the International Dictionary of Psychology. So this was like, this was the way things are. And I guess my task is to convince you that that's no longer the case. In the last 20, 30 years have seen some changes. So consciousness, where do we start? Well, I think the simplest place to start is the fact that we know there's a very tight dependence between conscious experience and the brain. Somehow, the collective activity of the 90 billion or so neurons inside your brains and bodies is giving rise to a conscious experience, the experience that you're having right here and right now, listening to these words. So the question that's motivated my research over the last years is, how can the structure and dynamics of the brain, in connection with the body and the environment, account for the subjective phenomenological properties of consciousness? And there are two aspects of this question I want to emphasize at the outset. Account for the subjective phenomenological properties of consciousness. And this means two things. Firstly, it means going a little bit beyond correlation. So you'll see a lot of work about consciousness tries to look for the neural correlates of consciousness that associate being conscious with activity in this or that region. Now, you all know that correlation is not the same thing as explanation. Just seeing two things correlate doesn't give you by itself an insight into the causal mechanisms or the why and how of that relationship. And the second thing is properties. So this is also a clue that rather than going after, and you might be a bit disappointed already now, because instead of saying why consciousness exists as a property of the universe in the first place, rather, I think the the most productive approach for a neuroscience of consciousness is to try to throw explanatory bridges between properties of phenomenology, of what it is likeness of consciousness, and those of the underlying neural mechanisms. And that's a slightly softer objective than trying to say, why is consciousness part of our universe at all? This, of course, is related to this famous distinction from David Chalmers, which is a good reference point for all this stuff, between the easy problem and the hard problem. Now, the easy problem, I'm sure most of you will know. Can I just get a show of hands? How many people are familiar with the easy-hard problem distinction? Okay, most of you. I'll say it very quickly then. The easy problem is the problem of figuring out how the brain works, how its complex networks underpin perception, action, cognition, and behavior. And the hard problem is figuring out how and why any of this should have anything to do with consciousness at all. Why aren't we just zombies going about our business without there being anything going on the inside? Now, the intuition that drives this distinction, of course, is that solving the easy problem wouldn't shed any light at all on the hard problem, that we could understand everything about how brains do what they do, and we'd still be faced with this big metaphysical mystery about why and how any of this should have anything to do with consciousness. Now, I think this is a really, really weird and destructive argument, actually, because firstly, we have no idea what it would be like to have any idea what it would be like to solve the easy problem. We just don't. It's asking you to imagine a state of affairs that's almost impossible for us to imagine. What would understanding the collective activity of 90 billion neurons in all their detail actually give us insight into? We have no idea. So there's another way to look at this, which has been called various things over the year. Varela called it neurophenomenology. Chalmers himself called it the mapping problem. I've started calling it the real problem, a little bit tongue-in-cheek. And this is just the idea. Unlike the easy problem, we still treat consciousness as something to explain. So we want to understand the properties of conscious experience. But unlike the hard problem, we don't try to explain why consciousness is part of the universe. We try to throw bridges, as I said, between properties of neural mechanisms and properties of phenomenology. And the intuition here is that as we start to account for the properties of consciousness, bit by bit, chipping away at it, then the basic mystery of why and how consciousness is part of the universe in the first place should start to fade away. And there's a precedent for this in the history of science. And this is kind of an overdone analogy in some respects, but I still think it's very helpful. And this is the analogy of our understanding of life. So at one time, biologists and biochemists were perplexed about how life could emerge from mere physics and chemistry. There had to be something else. There had to be a spark of life, an élan vital or an essence vitale. And of course, biologists no longer think this. We don't understand everything about life, but the basic mystery of the existence of life and how it arises from matter, a materialistic view of life, is no longer at issue. And one of the key insights here was that life is not one thing. There are many properties that define living systems that come together in different ways in different kinds of organisms. There's metabolism, there's reproduction, there's homeostasis. It's a constellation concept. And once you account for these properties, that defining feature of what life is becomes a little bit more finessed, a little bit more spread out, and a little bit more understandable. So the same strategy, I think, might apply to consciousness. And this means dividing it up into a few different kinds of things and going after those things somewhat independently. Now, they're not independent, they're all related, but we can approach them all independently. And heuristically, this is one approach to doing this, to think about conscious level. That's how conscious you are on a scale from being totally unconscious in a coma or vegetative state or general anesthesia to being awake, aware as you are now. Then there's conscious content. When you're conscious of something. The perceptions, the thoughts, the cognitions that populate your conscious scene, what the philosophers call qualia. And then there's conscious self, which is a subset of conscious content, but I think of it as sufficiently important to treat a little bit specially, which is the specific experience of being you. And as I'll come to later, even that splits up into a number of different kinds of sub-experiences, if you like, different kinds of perceptions. So let's start with conscious level. How do you explain the property of being conscious at all? And a first point here is that being conscious is not the same thing as simply being awake. And there's a long-standing distinction between conscious level, here on one axis and wakefulness on the other. Normally they correlate. When you're awake, you're also conscious, normally, conscious wakefulness, and as you go drowsy, light sleep, you lose consciousness too. But you can go off this diagonal too. When you're dreaming, you're having vivid conscious experiences, but you're by definition asleep. And on the other side, there are some pathological conditions like the minimally conscious and vegetative state. You'll be hearing about these later in this school, where you are presumably unconscious, certainly in coma, but in vegetative state too. But you go through sleep-wake cycles. So the mechanisms that control your physiological arousal are separable from those that underpin your conscious level at a particular point. So how do we track conscious level? And here's the first sort of computational theme for this talk, which is the idea that conscious level can be associated with measuring complexity in neural dynamics. And to go back to what Paul said, this is actually an idea that's been around for a while. It's what first drew me to go to San Diego 17 years ago. And this is sort of one version of it from Giulio Tononi, known as integrated information theory. Integrated information theory, for those of you who've been following it, is getting extremely arcane and complex. But the basic insight driving it is still very simple, and that is that every conscious experience that we have is highly informative. It's very different from every other conscious experience we could have, or will have, or have had. Even the experience of pure darkness rules out the simultaneous occurrence of a very large number of alternative possible experiences. It's very informative for the organism in the specific sense that it reduces uncertainty. Conscious experiences are also integrated. Every conscious experience you have appears unified, all of a piece. Now, these are phenomenological observations. Consciousness comes to us as a unified scene, and it also carries a lot of information. So these are descriptions of what the phenomenology of consciousness is like. But they are also descriptions that allow you to come up with some formal measures, some mathematics, some computational processes that have the same properties. And this is a first way at going beyond just looking for arbitrary correlations. You know, what happens to your thalamus when you have general anesthesia, towards trying to say, okay, this is what conscious phenomenology in general is like, so what kind of mechanism might underpin that? That's what's been driving all this work in integrated information theory for the last 10 years and other theories before that as well. And what it comes down to, very simply, is trying to find ways to characterize this middle ground between systems that are very, very highly connected, but which... this works. Very, very highly connected, but cannot enter very many different states because they're too highly connected. And systems which have no integration, they can enter lots of different states, but they're not bound together in any interesting ways. The middle ground for all this, where one has both integration information, is what's always been loosely called this domain of complexity. Not too simple, not too structured, and not too unstructured, this kind of sweet spot of complexity. Now, you can quantify and formalize this in all sorts of different ways, and people have done this in different ways over the years. And integrated information, which is just sort of, it's one way of doing this, which is a way of measuring the dynamics of a system such that you're capturing the extent to which the whole carries more information than the sum of the parts. That's just one way of doing it. There are various sort of mathematical approximations for this and other similar measures. I'm not going to go into the details of these because they don't work. That's the sort of first lesson. When you apply them to data in practice, none of these measures that are based on some sophisticated intuition about phenomenology give you any really, really decent empirical grasp at all. They don't do a very good job when you put them to the test against data. Why is that? Well, we won't come to that. Here's just, the story continues to go on. Max Tegmark, very famous physicist from MIT, recently weighed in and has come up with another whole set of measures of integrated information, and so on we go. What does work is something much simpler, and this is a lovely experiment, not from my lab, but from Marcello Massimini in Italy, who works with Giulio Tononi, the developer of IIT. And this is quite an old paper now, but I still want to show the basic result. What he did was use TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation, to sort of basically bang the brain or the cortex with a pulse of electromagnetic energy, and then use EEG to listen to the echo. So you can see here that when somebody is in an awake state, the response to the TMS pulse moves around the cortical surface in quite a complicated and long-lasting way. Whereas when you're asleep, this is all slowed down very much. The response is still there. It's quite big to start with, but it stays localized. And you can see, this is plotting it over time, to see a big initial response and then nothing asleep, and a complicated spatiotemporal pattern when the person was conscious and awake. What's been quite striking over the last few years is that these patterns can be quantified using this method where you basically binarize everything into a matrix when activity exceeds a threshold, and then you treat this as some kind of digital photo and try to compress it using a Lempel-Ziv compression algorithm, the same thing that generates JPEGs, and you get a number. And this is the idea, this is the first kind of quantitative consciousness meter, which is quite interesting. If you think about the role that measurement plays in the history of science too, our understanding of temperature and heat depended fundamentally on the development of reliable thermometers. Is this the first kind of thing, a thermometer for consciousness? And even in heat and thermometry, this was not an easy process. Sometime in the 18th century, people really argued about how you could measure temperature. And the fixed point of heat was taken at one point to be a piece of cheese in a basement in Paris somewhere, because it was just assumed that would change temperature the least. So we should not think that these are obviously distinct kind of challenges. Now this is cool. You can stimulate the brain and record the echo and quantify it, and you find that it has a great deal of empirical purchase. Here you see this is called the perturbation complexity index, wakefulness, and in various kinds of unconscious states, non-REM sleep, various anesthetics. And I think really importantly, you can see it tracking different conscious levels in clinical contexts here. People in the vegetative state and minimally consciousness with severe brain injury back up to healthy controls. And so you can begin to think this could be an objective way of measuring consciousness even in patients who can't respond behaviorally. Now, just to relate this to what we've been doing at Sussex with Adam Barrett and Michael Schartner, we decided to just measure the spontaneous complexity of neural signals without zapping the brain with TMS. And what we find here is very straightforward. Basically, you can just look at the spontaneous EEG and do some normalizing and then apply this Lempel-Ziv algorithm, and you see something very simple, which is complexity levels are higher in wakeful rest than in mild sedation than in general anesthesia. What this means, this isn't a full measure of integrated information. It's not characterizing the complexity of the neural response. It's merely characterizing the diversity here. How much effort do you need to describe the neural signal? A completely random signal would score highest on this kind of measure. But it works. It works in practice there. It works also when you apply it to intracranial data. This is data from a lab in Milan, collaboration with Michele Massimini. And we see again, these are just where the electrodes are in these patients. Again, here we cluster into different lobes, frontal, parietal, temporal, occipital. And you can see that complexity in rest and in REM sleep is higher than in non-REM sleep. Interestingly, so this is nice that REM sleep is basically the same as wakeful rest. We know you're more likely to be dreaming in REM sleep. Also, there are some unexplained things here, which is that this Lempel-Ziv complexity is higher in the frontal lobes than elsewhere in the brain, no matter what condition you're in. We don't know quite what's going on there. But it tracks loss of consciousness during sleep. And I just wanted to show you the last thing we've been doing with this, which applying these measures also to people after they ingested various psychedelic compounds. Because one of the questions we're interested in is what's the relation between conscious level and conscious content? Could you apply these measures that track the difference between sleep, wakefulness, and anesthesia to global changes in conscious content, where your experience of the world is altered in a fundamental way, but you are nonetheless still conscious? And perhaps one of the most striking examples of this are people having taken psychedelic compounds. Their experience of the world and self is very, very dramatically different, but they are still definitely conscious. And what we found here, quite strikingly, is that this Lempel-Ziv measure goes up pretty reliably, with a couple of exceptions for psilocybin and ketamine, for all subjects. These are individual subjects when they're when they're under this drug. These are just some sort of first-pass source localization. This is MEG data. This was kind of interesting, partly because it's the first time that people had observed this measure going above the waking baseline. Pretty much all the other experiments look at the loss of consciousness in sleep or anesthesia. Yeah.
So is it always correlated to the amount of blood flow, or do you think you're recruiting more cells in these different behaviors?
It doesn't seem to be correlated to the amount of blood flow. I mean, we didn't do a simultaneous PET or MR experiment with this data, but the same group we got the data from, this is data from the Imperial College group, Robin Cart, Harris, and so on. They've done PET and MR studies which show, if anything, slightly hypo-metabolic states, I think, but certainly no vast increase. It's a repatterning of the functional interactions. Now, this is just looking source by source. We're not looking, I'll show you another slide where we look at interactions. But, this is MEG, so I can't make any strong claims about what's happening at the cellular level. What we do know is certainly LSD and psilocybin work on the serotonin system, so they're changing something there. But you see something that goes above baseline, which is, so the brain is more random, more diverse than it is in the normal waking state. But that led to some interesting media, actually, because we got stuff like scientists discover evidence for a higher state of consciousness, which is confusing, which just points at the dangers of doing consciousness science and studying things like conscious level, because of, with nothing to do with what recreational drug users would call a higher state of consciousness. But it's nonetheless quantitatively not wrong.
I'm not sure whether you would have done the study to come to this conclusion. You could have said it before, right?
Well, it depends what you mean by higher state, yeah.
No, the brain on psychedelics behaves very differently from normal.
Oh yeah, well of course that's the only thing I said to the journalist, as you know, isn't it? I just repeated that 100 times and didn't say anything else, so yeah. Yeah, well, that's the Daily Mail as well, you're aware of. I put this in because they're the only ones that accompanied this with a very large sidebar about the dangers of LSD. It's kind of fun. We're continuing this stuff, looking at that's kind of the global complexity, but I'm also interested in what are the interactions between different neural regions in these conditions too. And this is just to show you some ongoing stuff where with Lionel Barnett we're looking at correlation and Granger causality. And I show this also for a little methodological point. What you can see here, correlation under each of these drugs between these different areas generally goes up. So that's interesting. There are more correlations between activity in different areas under the psychedelic drug. Yet, causal interactions go down. This is broadband across all frequencies. This is measured using Granger causality. How many people know about Granger causality? Okay, not that many. But I won't go into that too much data. It's basically a measure of directed functional connectivity or information flow between different time series, in this case, different MEG sources. And so there's less functional interactions directed, less information flow between different parts of the brain, at the same time more correlation. This is kind of interesting, showing that these two measures move in different directions, because we often tend to think things that are more correlated are exchanging information more frequently or to a larger extent. That is not necessarily the case, both theoretically, for these measures say different things. This is just how much things go together. This is how much one thing helps you predict the other thing. They can move in different directions in theory, and on this data they actually do. So there's less information flow, but more correlation.
FMRI?
No, this is MEG.
MEG, okay.
fMRI, the signal is too slow. I'm still not confident with Granger causality on fMRI.
So
and
what happens with the power spectrum?
This is broadband. The picture is pretty similar if you cut it up into frequency bands, though it's strongest in alpha for most of these. Just for those of you who do know about Granger causality, this is something half of my lab bangs on about all the time, because it's a very important but often misunderstood method. There was a paper just a couple of weeks ago in PNAS trying to raise lots of problems with Granger causality in neuroscience. All the problems they raised have already been solved by my postdoc, Lionel Barnett, and we just published this kind of response. We're trying to publish a response to it now. This debate just goes on. I just put this up in case you've seen this and are worried about it. If you haven't seen it and are not worried about it, continue to not worry.
Walk sleeping dogs.
Right, so this is a summary of the first part of the talk. Measures of conscious level then should reflect this kind of coexisting integration and differentiation, which is a description of phenomenology. But we're faced with this issue at the moment that in practice, simple measures that just in this case track the diversity or the randomness of signals that aren't that theoretically based do better than the more intricate theory-driven measures, which is a problem. Because ideally we would want measures that are closer to a good theory of consciousness to actually do better in practice, but they don't. They do worse. So the question now is to understand how and why, and are the theories wrong, or are just the way we're translating them into measures that are the way in which we do the operationalization? I hate that word, the operationalization. Is that where the problems are occurring? And finally, measures of conscious level may also reflect aspects of conscious content, which brings me, just to summarize that, level, a complex balance of differentiation and integration, onto the second part, which is all about conscious content. When we're conscious of something. And I'm going to appeal now to a different theoretical framework for this part and for the rest of the talk too, which goes back as far as you like, but I'll take it back to Hermann von Helmholtz, 19th century polymath, who first came up with the idea of perception as inference. He called it perception as unconscious inference because we're not aware of the process itself, just of the results. Now, there's a very intuitive way to think about this, which is that the problem of perception from the perspective of the brain itself. The brain is locked inside its bony skull. It has no direct access to things in the world, if indeed there are any things in the world. All it encounters are sensory signals, which are ambiguous and noisy with respect to things out there in the world, whatever they may be, objects and so forth. So assuming, and this is a big assumption, which we'll challenge in a bit, assuming that the purpose of perception is to figure out what's out there in the world that gives rise to these sensory signals, perception has to be a process of inference in which the brain's prior expectations about what's out there in the world are combined with these ambiguous and noisy sensory signals to come up with its best guess of the causes of those sensory signals. And this is, of course, formalized by this idea about Bayesian inference. So this is one way of thinking about the Bayesian brain. In order to make sense of ambiguous and noisy sensory data, you combine it with some prior expectation, and you come up with the Bayesian posterior, the best guess. In practice, or rather conceptually, what this means is instead of thinking about perception purely as this bottom-up process where sensory signals come into the brain and are increasingly elaborated into perceptions, conscious or unconscious, perception comes as much from the inside out as from the outside in. It's a property of these top-down predictions about the causes of sensory signals. I just want to give you one fun example that shows this in practice, and you may well have heard this before. Let's see if the sound is working. I wonder if it is. No. Is there sound?
It should be.
Yeah. It should be a cable.
Yeah, I've plugged it in. I should have checked all this before, but I didn't. Let's try it.
Jazz and swing fans like fast music.
So for those of you who haven't heard this before, did you understand that?
Yeah, because the integration measures didn't work.
Jazz and swing fans like fast music.
Getting there. Now listen to this.
Jazz and swing fans like fast music.
Okay, now listen to the first. I'm going to play exactly the same thing that I played at the beginning again.
Jazz and swing fans like fast music.
So now you should all understand that perfectly well, yes? And you will never be able to unhear that now. I've ruined it forever for you, that demonstration. That's an example of sine wave speech. Basically, these are the spectrograms of it. This is the unprocessed version, and this is the processed version. We've just cut out all the sharp transitions which define the spectral properties of natural speech. Makes it very, very difficult to understand. What's kind of cool about this is once you hear the full version, that gives your brain the prior expectation about what the degraded signal is all about, and that allows you then to perceive it. And I think this is interesting. It's an example of sort of predictive perception, but it's also an example of how quickly the brain can take in new information to update its perceptions, its interpretations of previously ambiguous data. It can happen very, very quickly indeed.
Jazz and swing fans.
Going around. So we know about Bayes, that's the idea. Sense data priors come up with some perception. And of course, this does lead us to think slightly differently about the functional anatomy of perceptual systems. Instead of perception being this bottom-up process from the outside in, we can think of it more as a top-down process. This is a schematic of one of the standard ways of thinking about how this process of inference might be implemented in cortical circuits, which is predictive coding or predictive processing. And the basic idea is that prediction errors, so sensory signals coming from the bottom up, just convey at each level the difference between what the brain expects and what it gets at that level. And predictions flow in the opposite directions from the top down. And the idea is that it's these predictions, these blue arrows, which go from deep layers to superficial layers in most articulations of this idea, that carry the contents of what we perceive. There are many other ways in which one might implement this kind of process of inference, with prediction errors flowing in both directions or laterally or skipping levels and whatnot. But this is one of the simple ways to think about it. This at the bottom just shows that this process is modulated by how much weight the brain applies to or gives to the sensory data versus its prior expectations. So if you weight the prediction error more strongly, corresponds to a sharper curve here, you draw the final perceptual inference more strongly in that direction. This corresponds, if you like, to attention. When you're paying attention to something, you're giving that sensory data more influence on how it affects your, what you will end up perceiving. So you can think of attention as a process of balancing the influence of prediction errors and predictions at every point in time. There's a lot of accumulating evidence from lots of different labs that something like this is happening in mammalian brains, at least. This is some very nice work from Lars Muckli, showing that you can decode the content of visual scenes from parts of the early visual cortex that don't receive any bottom-up information. So the idea is the decoding has to be based on top-down inputs, and the decoding is better in superficial layers than in deep layers. Some other work, again using Granger causality from André Bastos and Pascal Fries, looks at this ECOG data, and they show signals flowing from the top down and the bottom up across a whole hemisphere of the monkey visual cortex here in different frequency bands, again, as you might predict from some of these ideas about predictive coding. But predictive coding is not a theory of consciousness. Now, I've been talking in very generally about idea how perception might work in the brain, nothing specifically about consciousness at all. This is very different from the first part of the talk, where I was going directly from what the phenomenology of being conscious is like to some sort of mathematical operationalization. Here we have a very general theory of perception and indeed action and cognition. It's not a theory of consciousness, but I think that's actually a bonus. I think that's why it's a very good theory for doing consciousness science, because it's not trying to say, again, why consciousness exists at all. It provides a set of computational tools which allow us to map phenomenology to mechanism in a way that can be experimentally tested. You can ask, are we consciously aware of the prediction error, the prediction at different levels of a hierarchy, the precision? It gives you different quantities that you can associate with consciousness rather than just saying, is it the front of the brain, the back of the brain, gamma oscillations, or whatnot. And again, some early evidence speaks to the relevance of this perspective. This is from a long time ago. Alvaro Pascalioni and Vince Walsh showed that these top-down projections, in this case from V5 to early visual cortex, are necessary for being consciously aware of motion. So you can, even if the bottom-up connections are intact, they basically interrupt these using TMS, and they show that only when you interrupt the top-down connections do you abolish awareness of visual motion. Now, I just want to emphasize here there's a confusion. It's very easy to get into. People often think about the top-down connections as the feedback connections. You often hear about top-down, modulation, feedback. This is very different. Here, the feedback connections are really the sensory signals coming into the brain. They're the errors. If you think about what does feedback mean in control theory, it's usually the error term. And in predictive coding, that's what's coming into the brain from the outside. So I prefer actually to avoid feedback and feed forward entirely talk about top-down and bottom-up, or even better, inside-out and outside-in connections. But this was just a kind of observation that you need the integrity of these signals. We wanted to ask some questions in our lab that more specifically get at the role of predictions in consciousness. And a very simple starting point was just to ask, are we more likely to consciously perceive that which we expect, or that which violates our expectations? So in this very simple behavioral experiment, we just used continuous flash suppression, where you have a Mondrian image in one eye, which starts off at a high contrast and goes low, and an image which could be a face or a house in the other eye. So at some point you'll see the target image, and we lead people to expect to see either a face or a house, and then we measure how quickly the image breaks through. How quickly do they see it? And you have to do a whole load of control studies, detection, discrimination, attention, not attention, all this stuff. But in the end, it comes down to the basic finding that detection and identification, how well this target breaks through into consciousness, it breaks through faster if you're expecting it, if you have an expectation that's congruent with the sensory data. So expectations accelerate conscious perception. A PhD student who's now finished, Maxine Sherman, did a whole series of experiments like this using a slightly more sophisticated paradigm. And I just give you the basic principle of this. It's a detection paradigm here. So all people, you're led to, for each block of trials, you're led to expect that a Gabor patch is either unlikely to be present, so 25% not very likely to be present, or 75% very likely to be present, but probabilistic. So, depending on the block, it will still be sometimes there, sometimes not there. All you've got to do is detect whether it's there or not, absent, present, and then you give a confidence response. How confident are you that you saw it or not? So that helps us link it to not just perception, but conscious perception. The idea being, if you are confident that you saw it and your decision was correct, then you probably actually saw it and weren't just guessing. We have this concurrent task for attention, because you want to manipulate attention independently. If you think about it, these things are often conflated. If you expect something to happen in a particular part of your visual field, let's say, you often pay attention to that part of the visual field too. And these two things need to be experimentally separated. This is one way of doing it, using what we call a dual task design. But basically, the thing is, we're manipulating expectations specifically from unlikely to don't care to likely. And then we want to see what effect that has on how well people see this target. And I'll skip this slide, I think, and just go to the main result, which is that when people's expectations are congruent with their response, so if they say they saw it and they were expecting to see it, they generally have higher confidence. And they also have higher confidence when they were correct compared to when they're wrong. So they're more confident in their perceptual decisions when their expectations are aligned with their sensory data and with their responses. And critically, their metacognition is also improved when their responses are congruent with their expectations. Metacognition here is how well their confidence tracks their accuracy. When they say they saw it, were they more likely to be right? And this is the idea. This is independent of their ability to be right or wrong. So you're not just tracking their perceptual sensitivity, you're tracking how well what they think about what they did corresponds to what they did. How well their confidence tracks their accuracy. There are various ways to measure metacognition. This is called the M ratio, which is a measure from signal detection theory. Basically, we find that, again, it's this idea that expectations that match the situation lead to a more vivid conscious perception, in this case measured by metacognition. We use the same design for an EEG experiment to try to get at what the underlying neural dynamics are for how expectations impose their influence on what we perceive. So what we did here was we could record EEG, the same kind of paradigm, and we look not at what the EEG response is to the stimulus, but what was going on in the brain before the stimulus appeared. And this is an interesting point, because if you start thinking about predictions and expectations, you start to do different experiments. In many EEG experiments, you're interested in what happens after a stimulus. But when you think about expectations, you're often interested in what's happening, what was the state of the brain before the stimulus came. or before somebody did an action. And so here we're looking at pre-stimulus EEG, and this is a contrast between yes and no responses. So what was happening in the brain that maximally distinguished between them saying, yes, I saw something, and no, I didn't see something? And you see a peak in pre-stimulus alpha. And this is interesting because a lot of work, especially from the lab of Rufen van Rullen in France, has shown that pre-stimulus alpha, this oscillation at 10 hertz, in the visual cortex is predictive of a whole lot of things in visual perception, attention, stimulus detection, and so on. So we wanted to know, is it also associated with the effect of expectations on perception? So we could take a sort of a time point about 100 and something milliseconds prior to the stimulus onset at a particular frequency, about 10 hertz. And what we ask here, we then measure the power and phase of the alpha rhythm for each trial according to whether it was a hit or a miss or a false alarm or a correct rejection. And then we can look at how does the alpha phase at this time point correspond to whether the response, the behavior response, was in any of these categories. And what we find is this, that there's a sort of oscillation. So depending on the phase of the alpha in your brain, there's a particular phase where you're more likely to say yes and less likely to say no. And at the opposite phase, the situation is reversed. Or rather, sorry, that's wrong. What this is showing is there's a particular phase where what you expect has a stronger influence on what you say. So it's shifting, for those of you who know signal detection theory, there's a bigger shift in your decision criterion at a particular alpha phase. And another opposite phase where it's less shifted, so where the sensory data has the most impact. So it's as if, as your alpha rhythm is oscillating in the brain, in one phase, your predictions are strongly influencing what you say you see, and then the opposite phase, the sensory data, is more strongly affecting what you say you see. And the same is true, though, more noisily with confidence.
Can you
Yeah.
explain in more detail
Yeah.
between the confidence and the expectation sensory data influence? Is there any coupling between the two?
So the coupling between which?
Well, left and right, essentially,
Okay.
right?
So it's the same axis on the bottom. We're looking at pre-stimulus alpha phase. And in this graph, we're looking at it in signal detection theory, just C, the type 1 decision threshold. And that's a measure of, and these two, so that's a measure of your bias towards saying one thing or the other. And here the two conditions are whether the stimulus is, in this case, unexpected or expected. So here there's a big gap between the two conditions. So the sort of big gap here means that your expectations are having a big impact on your decision threshold, and it's concentrated around this phase compared to over here. This is saying, this is looking at a similar thing for confidence. It's much noisier, and it's not a decision threshold, it's just confidence response. But again, you could say at roughly the same phase, then the biggest difference in your confidence between congruent and incongruent is clustered around a similar phase. So there's a phase of...
Would you not say that confidence would also correlate with the impact of your expectations on your perception?
Yes.
They
They
co-vary.
co-vary,
Yeah.
yes. They co-vary, but in this... yeah, they do indeed co-vary.
So it means confidence might be an expression of to what extent you're biased by your expectations.
It's unclear what confidence really does reflect in perceptual decision. I mean, we think it reflects the sharpness of the posterior, you know, your confidence in your best guess. But it's quite hard to get at because all these things do tend to co-vary. We didn't have, basically what we'd like to do is have on this axis something like meta D prime, where we know that it's a measure of metacognitive sensitivity that's independent of these biases. But you need a shitload of trials to do that, because here we're dividing into lots of different pre-stimulus bins, and we don't have enough trials in each bin to calculate a meta D prime for each bin, so we've got to look at something a bit more brute, which is just confidence. I'm going to skip this experiment because how long have I been going? You know, I've got no idea how long I've been talking for.
You're doing great. You're doing great. So just keep on going.
Right, well, I'm going to skip this because I don't want to go for too long. But it was basically another experiment implicating the algorithm somehow. So to summarize those experiments, just to give you the take-home from that, valid perceptual expectations accelerate conscious access. You see things more quickly when you expect them. They enhance both confidence in what you see and metacognition. So it's not just your basic perceptual sensitivity, it's how confident you are in what you see and how accurate your confidence is with respect to what you saw. And there's emerging work, and I showed you a little bit of it, that implicates the algorithm in orchestrating the exchange of predictions and prediction errors, although that is, I put this in a different color because it's certainly not established. There's some other work which has just come out which I didn't have time to talk about. I wanted to instead just introduce, this is some new work I haven't talked about before, but it fits into this theme of conscious content, but in a very different modality. And this is time perception, which is always a struggle when listening to or giving a talk. How fast is time going? Now, there are no time sensors in the brain. Unlike visual sensors in the eyes and hair cells in the ears, we don't have, as far as we know, things that directly pick up time in the brain. So time has to be, even more sort of self-evident, time has to be an inference on some other sorts of data, our perception of duration, or our perception of whether things are simultaneous or not, is an inference based on some other sensory data. And traditional approaches to time perception involve an internal clock or pacemaker of some kind. And this is a very sort of standard approach. You think, how do we perceive time? Well, externally, I use a watch. I use something like a watch. So how does my brain do it? Well, it's probably got a kind of watch-like thing inside against which we track how events unfold, and then we might use that to make an estimate of how long something lasted. So there'll be things like a comparator, pacemaker, and here you've got pacemakers and accumulators, and you even have very modern theories like the striatal beat frequency model, which talks about different kinds of oscillations at different frequencies in the brain, and the beat frequencies of these oscillators give you, pacemakers at lots of different time scales. But they all, I think, are subject to a very old problem in thinking about perception and consciousness, which is the Cartesian theatre. Let's just put the problem further back in the brain. How do we perceive time? Well, there's a clock inside the head. That's a kind of unsatisfactory answer from the get-go, I think. So with Warwick Roseboom, who's been working with me for a couple of years on this, and is really the expert on this, we've been looking at clockless time perception. How might the brain come up with perceptions of time, especially perceptions of duration, without any kind of internal pacemaker at all? And the idea is that time is an inference on the dynamics of perception itself, and that doesn't have to involve any internal clock or any internal pacemaker. We all know this from sort of folk psychology. Time flies when you're having fun. More changes in a given epoch lead to a longer apparent duration. At the same time, apparent duration adapts to recently adapted or recently experienced rate of change. A watched pot never boils. How am I supposed to boil when he keeps staring at me like this? So we have the same time and a perception of the rate of change of events, but an expectation also about what the rate of a change of events should be in a given context. And these things contribute to our perception of time. There's a very, very deep philosophical pedigree for all this stuff, the idea that if something does not change, can it be ever argued to have a duration at all? It goes back to Hume and the empiricist philosophers. So what do we need to do clockless time perception? An ability to detect that the world is changing and some sort of normalization of this event detection so that you can adapt to recently experienced rates of change too. So something like feature detection and something like attention. Also, and I won't talk about this, but this is where the work is going, some ability to record changes of having occurred, having happened. So we can bring in the influence of memory on time perception too. You'll remember an event as being shorter or longer depending on the number of episodes that you remember as having happened. And the model we have for this is a sort of combination of a visual categorization and some basic attentional mechanism. So we're making use here of this very powerful techniques for deep neural networks to classify and recognize visual images. So the idea is you've got these neural networks. This is a pre-trained, off-the-shelf neural network used for image recognition, and it will interpret images. In this case, this is from Sussex campus, a cow slightly appears, at different levels of description, of basic features to object parts to objects at higher levels. Now, if you imagine this network being exposed not to a static image, but to a succession of images in a movie, then at each level you get changes in features. And you can basically record from moment to moment. And note, this isn't building time in by the back door. All this says is there is a rate of change of stuff in the network. And it doesn't matter what that rate of change is. But you can track how much change there is at each level of description or abstraction of this network. And you can do some threshold crossing stuff, and where you normalize the threshold so that if not much has changed for a while, the threshold gets a bit lower, so that a smaller change counts as a salient change, which is a fairly divisive normalization, fairly standard thing to do. And then you can sum over all the levels and come up with an estimate of time that's based, if you like, on the accumulation of salient changes at all levels simultaneously. So it's extracting rich sort of measure of the change of perceptual dynamics from a given image. And that will give you an estimated duration. And there's no clock in here. There's no internal pacemaker. There's just accumulation of change. So what we did to test this model was record a bunch of video across various kinds of scenes, cut it up into videos of different duration, and show these videos both to the network and to people, and have people estimate the duration of these videos as well. So they did a lot of boring experiments, 5 hours of estimate. Oh, that lasted about 3 seconds. This lasted a minute. We recorded around Sussex campus, in the city, and so on, to have different densities of events per se. And just to summarize what we've been finding is that the model shows a very nice fit to human data. So this is human reports. You see, obviously, a correlation between the actual duration and the estimated duration. There is a characteristic bias here, and you can just see it. It's slightly off diagonal. So humans tend to over-report the duration of short durations and underestimate long durations. This is called Vieret's law. It's a regression to the mean thing. It's a very standard bias in perception generally. This is what it's called in time perception. Our model does pretty much the same thing. It's kind of accentuated there. So it's providing a nice fit to estimating duration based just on perceptual dynamics. What's really cool about this, I thought, was that we measured eye tracking at the same time that people were looking at these videos. And when we constrained the input to the model based on where people were looking in the scene, the model fits much more closely. So it's not just the information in the image per se, it's really dependent on where people thought the salient changes were happening in the image. So you get a much better fit when you constrain the input by human gaze. And it's not just the constraining itself. If you shuffle the trials and apply a different eye tracking vector to a different video, so you still have a constrained input, but it no longer matches what people thought was relevant, then it goes wrong again. So this is kind of ongoing work, but it's showing that time perception is also a sort of inference, but in this case, an inference based on perceptual dynamics rather than
Can you explain this sort of normalizing effect of the eye movements?
Well, when the images are exposed to the network, there's no attentional processing of the image per se. It's just going to estimate across all the input that it gets how much change is going on at each level. So if you filter that image to specific spatial locations, then you're potentially going to change or alter the amount of change from frame to frame. So the question was, if you do that, in a way that reflects where people are actually looking on a scene, is that going to make it a better fit to the estimated time? Is that going to give you an estimate of the salient changes from frame to frame, which end up providing a better match to their estimate of duration? Does that make sense?
Well, not completely, because it's sort of, I feel you're now really describing what you did, but can't you argue that, for instance, if you have slowly changing scenes, humans underestimate their duration, right? That's what you show.
Yes.
They think they're shorter than they really are, right?
I always get it the wrong way around, but I think that's right. Yeah.
But this might have to do with slowly changing scenes have a rate of change that is sort of below a sensitivity that the standard human perceptual system seeks. So you start to make saccades at a certain regular pattern that sort of makes it more difficult for you to actually estimate this slowly changing features. And that might lead to your bias, which you then filter out if you start to include these eye movements.
Right.
Because then you counteract that bias.
Okay, but this is not differentiating between scene type here.
Okay.
So this is across all the scenes. I don't have the slide here which shows how the model and people perform. But you're right, people will tend to will tend to think that slowly changing scenes are even shorter than they should be. And those videos were typically taken from around Sussex Downs. It was obvious when we put those through the network that there was probably going to be the least good fit anyway, because for the network, it only cared about whether a cow was in it or not. And that was, that's the only object from which it was trained, either a cow or a tree. Anything else didn't care about at all. But when we added the eye movements in that case, it did do a lot better, because indeed, possibly, humans in that case as well were searching around more, looking for something that was happening. But it wasn't just the fact that they were making eye movements and mixing up the visual scene that made the difference, because if you shuffled it and applied those eye movements, so you'd have the same sort of turnover of visual information per se, but it would not be coupled to that visual scene. It didn't do so well.
There's a whole class of models with objective functions, right, that learn on the basis of slowly changing features.
Yeah, so there are these slow feature. We haven't directly compared those, but this is not the same thing, because we're looking at features across at all levels of visual abstraction, and not just picking out slow changes in networks.
Hierarchical, but then in those models, you do have characteristic time constants still in the layers of your network.
Yeah.
So that would still mean that there's an intrinsic sensitivity to time, right? And that's what you try to get away from. You try to have no intrinsic tuning to time.
Well, you mean there's got to be something that changes over time. So you could argue that the time constant of a network that's optimized for detecting slow changes would give a basis for perception of time. I think that would not be incompatible with this.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Can we assume that people were not allowed to count, like internally?
You can't ever safely assume that, but they were instructed not to.
Okay, they were instructed.
Yeah. Which means they probably were, of course. But, yeah.
And the students in Sussex always do what they're told.
Yeah. So just to summarize this bit, and then I'm going to wrap up pretty soon. Duration perception we're beginning to think of here as an inference about rate of change of perceptual features. So the last thing I'm going to talk about is trying to get then even closer really to the phenomenology of conscious content. What it's like, and not just detecting things like, was there a Gabor patch in this image or was there not, but how do we get closer to explaining what, in this case, visual phenomenology is really like? And one thing, just as an example of this, I want to talk about a property of visual experience called objected, or what other people have called perceptual presence. And this is the idea that objects in our visual awareness appear to us as objects. So this thing appears to me as having a back and sides, even though I can't directly see the back and sides. I perceive it as having three-dimensional extension in the world, as being an object, and not, of course, a picture of an object. And this is the classic artistic takedown of the distinction between an image and the thing itself. So this is an image. It's actually an image of an image, but it's certainly not a pipe. There are many situations where experiences of objecthood of visual things is changed. So in synesthesia, people, graphene color synesthesia, something else we've done quite a lot of work on in the lab. A characteristic thing about synesthesia that people don't often talk about is that if somebody is synesthetic so that they see the letter Y as being green, let's say, they know and they don't experience the green as a real property of the object, of the letter Y. The greenness might be spatially co-located or not, but it's certainly not a greenness that's out there in the world in the same way that the letter itself is out there in the world. It doesn't have this sort of perceptual presence or reality in the same way. So what you can ask, well, how is it that I see some things in my visual experience as objects and other things as not? And there's an old set of ideas that talks about this, going back to Kevin O'Regan and Alvin Noe, sensorimotor contingency theory, talks about presences resulting from an implicit knowledge or mastery of the sensorimotor contingencies governing how sensory signals respond to actions. So the idea here, in this old set of ideas, is that I see this as an object because my brain somehow knows what would happen if I were to move around it or to move it around. So I would master the set of sensorimotor contingencies that pertain to my interactions and my potential interactions with this object. So it's a kind of, I think, quite a nice idea that perception is not just a passive encountering of sensory signals, but it has to do with what one might do with those sensory signals or operate on the causes of those sensory signals. It's a more inactive, embodied, interactive approach, if you like. But there's no mechanism here. So one thing you can think about is how might one think about that idea in terms of predictive perception? So here we have predictions and prediction errors. And this brings in the concept of active inference here. If perception is in the business of minimizing prediction error, so that we predict and are able to explain away the causes of sensory signals, there are two ways of doing that. You can either update your predictions, or you can make actions to change the sensory data. If I expect to see Paul and I'm looking over there, I can actually look around over there and see Paul, and then my prediction is happily fulfilled. So there's two ways to minimize prediction error. And this Carl Friss and others have called active inference. Now, active inference actually adds a significant demand to the perceptual system, because now it's not just about predicting the causes or explaining the causes of current sensory input. It implies a capability to make conditional or counterfactual predictions about the sensory consequences of possible actions. If I'm going to make an action to reduce prediction error, I have to predict what would happen as a result of that action. What would the effect be on my sensory input? So this provides a nice way, I think, in the framework of predictive processing to talk about this idea of mastery of sensory motor contingencies. The perceptual system is able to generate and leverage a large number of predictions about the possible sensory consequences of actions. It doesn't have to do them, they can remain potential, but they have to be there. And this is kind of interesting because it fits with what I've been talking about before about perceptual content depending on the predictions, not the prediction errors. So here the idea is some aspects of my perception could be based on predictions that are never actually executed. They're just predictions about what might happen were I to make an action of a particular kind. So I wrote a very long and boring paper about this, which I don't recommend you read because it's far too long, trying to explain all this and apply it to various contexts in which our perception of perceptual reality is changed, not only in synesthesia, but in various kinds of hallucinations as well. There are some hallucinations where people recognize that hallucinated content is not real, Charles Bonnet syndrome being one of those. But there are other cases where people experience the hallucinations as real as things that actually are real.
But this paper you partially wrote on the beach here, no?
Yeah, I did partially write it on the beach here. It started partially on the beach. It's a good historical point. These seem quite abstract, but we're thinking about how to test some of these ideas here. So this is an experiment with my postdoc Kesuke Suzuki. And here we can use virtual reality or augmented reality to have situations where we have virtual objects which implement different kinds of sensorimotor contingency. So that first was an object that behaved normally. That was an object that always presented the same face. And here's an object that has unreliable or unpredictable sensorimotor contingencies. So we can actually begin to mess around. They're all unfamiliar objects, so we can begin to mess around with the predictions that somebody's brain would be able to make about the sensory consequences of their actions in a way that you can't do without that kind of technology. And actually what this is boiling down to now, because with VR experiments, as some of you may know, it's very difficult to hit the right balance between allowing people to explore freely but still maintaining the experimental control that you need. And so what we've done here is we have a sort of reduced situation where people rotate a virtual object in front of them. You can sort of, and we use a virtual reality version of continuous flash suppression here. So there's a virtual object on this marker here. They're perceiving it through a thing. And we, again, measure how long that virtual object takes to break through this mask. And we can manipulate both whether their actions, basically that video I showed you before, how that object responds to their actions. We can manipulate that. So we can manipulate the sensorimotor contingencies and look at its effect on conscious access. And what we're finding, and it's still ongoing, is that it makes a difference. So this is just, these two blocks are replay versus live. When we replay a video from a previous trial, so we break all sensorimotor contingencies, the object is harder to see. And also the difference between these bars, when the object moves as the brain might expect it to move, as a real object would move, it's easier to see. So the two facts. So there's something about expecting, being able to predict the sensory consequences of actions that leads to more rapid access to consciousness. This is not exactly the same thing as saying that they perceive this as a real object. And we've tried very hard to think how to operationalize that, to measure how much people perceive an object as real. We haven't come up with a particularly convincing way to do that yet.
But how do you exactly capture the notion of a sensorimotor contingency here? Because the subject is rotating the object?
Yeah, so we've reduced the degrees of freedom in which the contingency can operate. In that initial example, they could do pretty much anything they wanted. And the problem there is they do pretty much anything they want, and then your data are too... So we had to reduce it to, does the virtual object rotate congruently or incongruently with the direction they're rotating this thing? So it's now a much simpler, reduced thing.
The position of the hand is far removed from the location of the object. So that this decoupling, don't you think that might be...
It's potentially a problem, yeah. But the problem is it's just a technical thing. You can't have them overlapping because then you can't have the AR marker work. So they have to be separated a bit. And hopefully that's the same for all conditions. So you hope it's not having a systematic biases. But it's not great. And just for fun, I have to show you this video. What happens if your perceptual priors are too strong? So you think about perception as depending on your predictions of the causes of sensory data, then you can begin to think about, well, maybe hallucinations are what happens when your predictions overwhelm the sensory data. And so to be completely honest, we've not done any kind of convincing experiment with this, but we just took panoramic video at Sussex campus and we processed it through one of these deep dream algorithms, which is there for identifying different breeds of dogs. And if you run it backwards, then it basically processes the image at each frame as if dogs are there. And if you join up the frames neatly enough and do some other visual processing, you get something that looks a little bit hallucinogenic. So I just showed this just to give you the idea that there might be some substance to our phenomenology, both normal and abnormal, being mainly constituted by the predictions about the causes of sensory signals, because really that's what this network is doing. It's applying overly strong perceptual predictions to sensory data. And you can do it at different levels too. So that's whole objects. This is we just processed one perspective here. This is an intermediate level where you fix an intermediate level. So now, rather than being predisposed to see dogs, this is predisposed to see dog parts everywhere. So you sort of see eyes and various things. And it has a kind of weird stylized feel. So one sort of way this might go is it's a systematic way to model different kinds of unusual phenomenology. You can start to match computationally what people describe under different sorts of unusual perceptual experiences, different drugs of different kinds, different psychoses of different kinds, geometric hallucinations versus complex object-based hallucinations. You could start to model these in terms of the operations of these networks. Okay, and we begin to do this actually. So this is just a behavioral questionnaire where we sort of look across between subjects, look at how people report the effects of psilocybin and how they report the experience of being in this immersive virtual reality thing. And you see it's kind of similar on this spider plot compared to control. So this is a way of quantifying, at least in terms of behavioral reports, the similarity between these different manipulations of phenomenology. Now, I am going to wrap up now because I don't want to bore everybody silly, but just to finish, I wanted theoretically where I want to take a lot of these ideas is now to our understanding of being a conscious self. And the idea here is just as we predict our visual perception is constituted by predictions of the causes of sensory signals from the external world, our experience of being a self is also constituted by predictions about sensory signals coming from the body, from both proprioception, sense of body position, and from interoception, the sense of the internal state of the body. And I think these sorts of predictions underpin, at the very least, two fundamental aspects of being a conscious self. The experience of having a body, what object in the world is our body, and the experience of being a body, this very, very basic experience of being an embodied organism is somehow dependent on predictions about the causes of signals from inside the body. So we have this basic picture that embodied selfhood depends on predictive models of the causes of self-related signals across all these different domains. And I'll just skip rapidly to the end now. But this is just applying the machinery of predictive coding to interoceptive signals. Just as brain has to make best guesses about signals from the world, it also has to do the same for signals from within the body. And when it's making predictions about signals from within the body, interoceptive signals reporting on the physiological condition of the body, my guess anyway is that's what we experience as emotions, the brain's best guess of causes from inside the body. These affect also our experiences of what the body is. You've all seen the rubber hand illusion, which is a beautiful demonstration of the plasticity of our experience of body ownership. We can begin to assimilate a fake hand into our experience of what is and what is not our body, and that's a very nice way to test it. This also works, and this is work we did as part of the SEEDS project with Paul. This also works when we combine heartbeat signals with virtual hands. So you're more likely to perceive a virtual hand as your own hand if it's pulsing in time with your heartbeat than if it's pulsing out of time with your heartbeat. So the brain is putting together signals from inside and outside the body in determining what in the world is its body. And that's measured in various different ways. So this is where I bring everything together and stop. We can think about making actions in the world to figure out what's there. We can think about predictive processing as a set of experiments trying to understand what's out there in the world. When we make eye movements to explore a visual scene, that's what we're doing. And when I experience an object as an object, that's what I'm doing too. I'm trying to figure out what's out there. How would the object respond to my various movements? But also, prediction allows control. If I can predict what's going to happen to a system, I can prevent perturbations from disrupting that system. And for inside the body, that's what matters. I don't need to necessarily figure out what's in here. I don't need to perceive the internal internal condition of my body in terms of objects. I know there are objects inside my body, but I don't perceive them as such. Why not? Well, it's not just because they're interoceptive signals rather than visual signals. It's because the process of perception for the internal state of the body is not to do with finding out what's there. It's to do with controlling what's there. It's to do with staying alive. And I think the phenomenology of that is very different. The phenomenology of prediction that's targeted at control is going to be very different from prediction targeted at figuring out what's there. So we have this oscillation between control and perception of the world. And so exteroception emphasizes finding out what's there. Interoception emphasizes controlling what's going on. And our sense of being a body, and this is now in the realm of speculation, but our experience of being a body depends, I think, on this control-oriented prediction about the causes of signals from inside the body. And then you can even think of predictive perception generally, since it's all based on this fundamental imperative to stay alive, it's all stemming from this basic imperative to maintain, to regulate one's internal physiological condition. And so, whereas in the external world we experience objects as the causes of sensations, when we experience the basic perception of being a body, that's really an experience of how well or how badly predictive regulation of our internal physiological condition is going. We don't perceive objects, we perceive something else. So I'm going to, there's various models that align with this in different ways, Lisa Barrett's work. There's a lot of lines of thinking that are converging on the idea that the body and the way in which we maintain our physiological condition is not just some sort of support machinery for the brain. The way we experience the self and the world is very, very intimately tied to the regulatory processes that keep the brain and body alive. So it puts metabolism and other forms of energy regulation at the core of everything that we experience, consciously or unconsciously. And this speaks to some very old ideas about how closely life and mind are linked together. When I first came to the summer school 10 years ago, Carl Friston had just given a talk on free energy theory, which I missed, and I thought I would come and everyone would tell me what it was all about. And I came and experienced this blank wall of bemusement. No one seemed to have any idea. 10 years later, it's still kind of relatively similar. And just to mark the process of time perception again, we started a paper in 2008 trying to review the mathematical details of the free energy principle and have only just submitted the paper 10 years later. But this also has some of the same ideas, that everything about the brain and mind stems from organisms that try to minimize the uncertainty of the states they encounter. They basically need to keep themselves alive. This translates into prediction error minimization in all the things that they do. And the last word goes to Descartes. And instead of his dualism between mind and matter, Descartes was pretty notorious for thinking that non-human animals don't experience anything. They're just beast machines. If you cut them, they bleed. That's no sign of any conscious experience. That's just because they're made of flesh and blood. They're beast machines. What these ideas I've been just mentioning at the end suggest is it's rather the opposite, that we have conscious selves and are conscious at all, not in spite of, but because of the fact that we're flesh and blood animals that try to keep ourselves alive, because of and not in spite of our beast machine nature. So I'm not going to go through that because I've said it and I want to finish. I just thank, these are the people in the lab, done the work that I've been talking about, and these are the external collaborators. He's got too long a name to fit on. And I leave it there. Thank you very much.
Access will moderate the discussion session if he gets a microphone. Are there?
Yeah, one is coming.
Ah, very good. All right. Yeah.
Thank you for the nice talk. Let's open the floor to questions.
Kind of a question versus comment. So in order to know, for our brain to have predictions, during development, the environment is constantly changing, and we're building our brain, right, based on the sensory context. And you don't talk about that all. I mean, have you thought about the fact that we are building a very specific consciousness with a set of predictions for a very particular environment, and that would be a very different sort of consciousness if the brain developed in a very different environment?
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. We don't work on the developmental aspect of these things in my lab, but it's clearly very, very important. I mean, there's lots of empirical questions about, you can reframe this whole aspect of the influence of developmental context on cognition in terms of the kinds of predictions that can be structured via experience.
And at what state does consciousness emerge in a developing organism?
Yeah, well, so that's also, there's only beginning to be, I think, empirically compelling work on that on that issue, because a lot of work in development has looked at more, if you like, high-level aspects of self-consciousness, like when does mirror self-recognition happen? When do things like object permanency, stuff like that? What about basic visual phenomenology? And some really nice work by Sid Quider and Ghislaine Dehaene in Paris started to look for things like signatures of metacognition and also neurophysiological signatures of visual perception that relate to the kinds of things we see in adults. So this gets a little bit away from prediction, but for instance, a classical neurophysiological signature of conscious perception in a masking paradigm is a P3. So if you have a masked visual stimulus, if you say you see it, that often corresponds to seeing a big peak at 300 milliseconds, P300. Activation of the global workspace, been interpreted in various different ways. So you might say, when do you see that in development? It gets really, really tricky, because you can do a masking, you can get infants to do masking paradigms. Difficult, but you can do it. But you don't see anything like a P300, but that's probably because the nervous system isn't myelinated, so you don't see these sort of sharp transients. But you do see something, which is sort of a longer, slower response that still distinguishes the masked from the unmasked condition. So does that mean that visual consciousness is emerging gradually? I think it's not possible to say, but it's a starting point to get empirical traction on the issue. You can do the same with metacognition, so you can use preferential looking paradigms to sort of try to evaluate confidence in a perceptual decision that an infant may have. And you see signs of that very early on too. And I think it's a classic lesson that the harder you look, the earlier you see these things. And there's even some stuff I was hearing about earlier this year that we typically think of mirror self-recognition as emerging at about 18 months. But if you train an infant to do it, they can do it at 10, 12 months. And so these things are much more context-dependent than one might have thought. I don't know, and correct me if I'm wrong, anybody, I don't know of any work that specifically adapted the kinds of paradigms here that look at the effect of predictions on perception in development. And that'd be kind of difficult to do, but not impossible.
You started off by criticizing David Chalmers' easy-hard distinction. And I think what you said was that actually the hard problem may come down to solving lots of the easier problems. And I just want to push you on that. Do you think that consciousness is a weakly emergent property when you have a system that does all the so-called easy problems well, then you get consciousness?
So I'm not sure I want to put it that way. It's sort of, the older I get, the more Dennett-like I seem to become, which I'm slightly worried about, actually. It's not necessarily the case that I think that solving all the, I wouldn't call them easy, but the problem with the easy problem is that it doesn't talk about consciousness at all. So I think it's more solving all these mapping problems where you try to say, okay, what's the properties of visual experience? How do I explain that? What's the properties of volitional experience? How do I explain? If I've added up all those pieces, does consciousness, have I solved the hard problem? Well, that presupposes that there is a hard problem. Yeah, and I'm not, so what I'm wondering is in solving all the other problems, in doing what science generally can do, which is predict and explain, is there going to be an explanatory residue which we're tempted to still allocate to the hard problem? Because this wasn't the case in life. It wasn't the case that you then say, okay, life is an emergent property of all these other bits of stuff that we've explained today. Well, there's no explanatory residue left over, and life is not just one thing. The hard problem perspective still drives you to the view that there's something that is there to be explained, that is the presence of consciousness at all. And I am not sure whether that problem will look the same after we've gone through the business of being able to predict and explain the properties of phenomenology. It's this false assumption, it's very difficult intuition to get rid of, that consciousness is one thing that has to be explained. Because we experience our consciousness in a particular way, it has particular properties. We tend to think, well, that's what has to be explained. One of the lessons from the lab and also from the clinic, and this Oliver Sacks stuff, is that that's arbitrary. The way we experience the world and self is just one possible way of experiencing the world and self. And if you can account for that, if you start to realize that, then the hard problem becomes already less dominant in what you do. I'm reluctant to talk about things like emergence, weak or strong emergence. I mean, strong emergence I don't like talking about at all, because people typically then say, what's an example of strong emergence? And they talk about consciousness. And I think, well, come on, you're just chasing it around in a circle of ontological confusion if you do that. But weak emergence is something that's quantifiable and applies to dynamic systems generally, and I think is a very, very useful way to understand how populations of wholes depend on and constrain the operation of their parts. And I think that might be a very useful perspective to account for global features of phenomenology, like why do we experience and how do we experience a unified conscious scene when it's composed of the activity of component parts that are doing to some extent their own thing. But I don't think that directly is the bridge from this kind of neuroscience approach to what Chalmers would call the hard problem.
It does sound like a limited stance in that ultimately you could have a lot of explanations for the system properties that you're describing, which will be better and more accurate ways of talking about what the brain is doing and about what human experience is, for which the label of consciousness is no longer useful.
So it's not an eliminative stance, because I'm not saying that it's a materialistic stance, but it's not an eliminative stance, because I'm not denying the reality of phenomenal experience, just trying to explain it. It may be eliminative with respect to the explanatory value of the word consciousness in the end, but it's not eliminative with respect to phenomenology, unlike the sort of the Churchland type approach. Phenomenal experience is real.
So to follow up on that, you now speak of the real problem. It's a bit tongue-in-cheek, I'm sure, but you try to distinguish another set of problems, another focus, other sort of methodological commitment. But now, what are the criteria with which you can assess whether you have answered that real problem? Because as you also see in your own work how it evolves, right? You also spend a lot of time looking at these complexity measures, and there was really a hope at some point in time that this might actually give us some mileage, right? Understanding consciousness, and that hasn't really panned out. And now you see that we get like a fragmentation of a lot of empirical, experimental approaches to really very small aspects that we can possibly link to then these assumed properties of consciousness. Mm-hmm. So where are we heading now? When do you know that you answered your real problem?
Well, you're probably not gonna know. It's more an approach rather than an explanatory goal to get there and plant a flag. I think that's probably true of most things in science, right? Maybe sequencing the genome. Maybe there are exceptions. But I wouldn't be too down on how things have gone over the last 10 or 20 years anyway. I mean, these complexity measures are showing promise. Maybe not in the way that some of us might have hoped. So actual measures of integrated information are very difficult to apply. But other measures, like these lempels, are doing a pretty good job. And we're beginning to come closer to quantification. And the direction of travel there, I think, it's a good example, because the direction of travel is to figure out why and how the more theoretically inspired measures are performing less well. Is it because the theory is flawed? Is it because we're not able to match the theory to the data in the right way? And I think that's a productive way of thinking to follow.
If you want to plant a flag somewhere, you need a map, right? And if you go to psychology, in some sense, there's some sort of consensus on what are the key phenomena we should explain. Let's say motivation, personality, memory, attention, perception. We all agree, yeah, that stuff we got to explain. These are the phenomena we have to explain.
Yeah.
But now with consciousness, we all start to get a little bit weak in the knees. Like, well,
maybe we can shuffle it into the perception domain, and we make it a perception story, or we move it toward, let's say, motivational, interoceptive kinds of processes. So is consciousness now on that map, and we have to explain it as a phenomenon that stands on itself, or do you see it really fragment the way what we see now into all these other subdomains of psychology?
Yeah, I think it does seem to be fragmenting a bit, and I mean that's not necessarily a bad thing either. Again, the story with how life was studied is one example where that kind of fragmentation can be quite productive. The challenge is then how to draw all these things back together again. It's in a sense it's a sign of a bit more maturity that you can. There are still some very clear empirical criteria for what counts as a study of consciousness. Is there a difference between? Does it include some aspect of phenomenology? Is there a difference between conscious and unconscious processing that you can speak about at the level of different levels, neurons, brain activity generally, report, and so on, or overall responsiveness of the organism. So I think but then within you can apply those criteria in different ways to different domains, and that's where I think we're at the moment. And you do see that fragmentation. In the end, it can be very difficult to sort of force yourself back to saying, no, we're really studying consciousness, because people, well, you're just studying perception, or you were just studying the neurophysiology of sleep. What binds all these things together? It may be that there's not that much common ground between, let's say, complexity measures that track conscious level and what determines the phenomenology of my visual scene right now. On the other hand, there may be, and I think it's only by continuing to think about the relevance of the ideas for consciousness that you think how to put these together. It may be that there are some aspects of predictive perception. Let's say this predictive perception story is somewhat on track. Then you can begin to at least draw some initial connections and say, okay, well, maybe whether a prediction becomes part of my visual phenomenology depends on how much information it generates, how many alternatives does a particular posterior rule out. That has some abstract connection already to integrated information theory. Maybe you need to have a system where in the global state rules out a lot of alternatives to be conscious. You can start to bring them together, but you don't want to do that too quickly because you just build castles on the sand in that case. So I think it is a bit fragmented right now, which is why it's really important to make sure in all of these studies, what is it we're trying to explain? It's not just behavior. So I'll give you one example of a project I didn't talk about because we haven't finished yet, but peripheral vision. And back to vision again. Peripheral vision is enormously fascinating because its phenomenology is very hard to describe, right? It's not blurry out there, but it's not sharp either. What is it? Way back in the 60s, people talked about peripheral vision as somehow statistical in nature. There's a distinctive phenomenology to it, which I think we can now begin to get at with some of these computational concepts from predictive coding. Are we perceiving, for instance, the variance of visual information out there in the periphery? Turns out probably not, but at least it's a sort of a nice idea where you can begin to think about describing the phenomenology in terms of some mechanism that makes it different from central phenomenology. And without that idea about that's what we're trying to explain, you wouldn't look at peripheral vision in the same way. You'd look at its resolution, you'd look at how well you can make eye movements there and so on.
Right. Okay. Fair enough.
Okay. So you have said that two aspects of consciousness that you've mentioned, and I think that they are very important, are qualia, so like the redness of red, and also the unity of consciousness. Do you have any intuition about the mechanisms of those two aspects? Because I don't see how predictive coding can be related to specifically those two things.
Well, the first one is the sort of the biggest tripwire in the whole thing, qualia, the redness of red. I think to ask what the mechanism of that is in a way to go back to this hard problem perspective. What is it about neurons that generates somehow generates consciousness compared to what it doesn't? I think talking in terms of qualia is really talking in terms of what's the phenomenology like. So why is Why is an experience of color or an experience of smell different from an experience of emotion, different from an experience of intention? Rather than trying to explain why there are qualia in the first place. And so this is a challenge, and it's a challenge for any theoretical perspective on consciousness. And I think predictive coding is maybe not going to be the answer, but it provides one way to try to understand the differences between different kinds of qualia. And so for the example that I gave a little bit here was why we perceive some things as objects and other things as not objects. And objecthood is a particular phenomenological feature. You might want to call it qualia, you might not, I don't really care, but we experience some things as objects and other things as not. And we can do that even given the same raw sensory data. So what makes a difference? And you can try to tell a story about that difference in terms of the kinds of predictions that a perceptual system would bring to bear on encountering that data. So I think you can approach phenomenology through the mechanisms of predictive coding. And in terms of unity, it's a very interesting question. Is that a consequence of a hierarchical organization where you have higher levels of predicting what's going on at multiple lower levels that span different modalities and different parts of visual space and vision? I think that's quite plausible as well. Of course, with unity, the interesting thing is where it breaks down, where some aspects of consciousness become segregated from the full conscious scene or just disappear entirely. So the question here is unity of consciousness something that has to be actively constructed by some sort of hierarchical integration in the brain or not?
All right. Let's thank the speaker one more time. Thank you. Okay, so we'll be having a 15-minute coffee break outside, and we'll get back at around 11:45.